Happy New Year! I know it's February, but I don't care. It took me a while to make this video. And hey, it's not going anywhere. Maybe next year. Maybe next year you can watch it on New Year's. Have a good time. We all saw some shit in 2020. That's fair to say, right? Without being annoying. And the thing about the new year is that objectively it's meaningless, but I do think that there is some meaning to the meaning that we have ascribed to it. You want to know what my New Year's resolution is? It's to stop making these fucking videos, and I'll tell you exactly why that is. Half a year ago when I started this series, streaming movies felt like a marginalized group within the context of cinema. Last November, watching the Golden Globes, a Martin Scorsese movie on Netflix felt like a seismic event. But now at the end of this project, I've reviewed movies from the likes of Charlie Kaufman, Aaron Sorkin, Robert Zemeckis, Sofia Coppola, all putting in the work for an internet-exclusive release. And I was fascinated by the way that the category was evolving, especially in the context of a pandemic. But now, most of a year and one pandemic later, the lines are finally starting to blur. Dozens of movies that were meant to come out in theaters have been pushed to streaming, whether that's VOD, paid rental, or just part of a subscription service. Especially with the new Warner Brothers HBO Max deal, whether a movie comes out on streaming or in cinemas feels more political than anything else. And that's exactly why I'm putting Full Stream Ahead away. 6 months ago when I started, describing something as a direct-to-streaming movie felt like it meant something. But now, I just don't really feel like it does anymore. But I am getting a little bit ahead of myself, because I do still have about a dozen movies from December of 2020 to review before I start wrapping stuff up. So first up is Superintelligence, which is kind of like Her if it was directed by Melissa McCarthy's husband. This was actually a movie that came out in November, but I watched it in November and I totally forgot about it when I was making the video. It just didn't make the cut, I guess. Just completely flew out of my brain, and I feel like that speaks for itself. Godmothered is a new comedy on Disney+, and if you think that pointing out how inaccurate Disney princess movies are is very funny, you will find this movie hilarious. 1 out of 10. Safety is a new movie on Disney+, all about how hard it is to be a college athlete. It's got mostly charming writing and performances, but at absolutely no point does it have any momentum or stakes. It also seems to have rubbed some people the wrong way politically, but honestly, ethics in college football is not a subject I feel equipped to speak about. So I don't know, it was fine. 5 out of 10. A California Christmas is every bit a Netflix rom-com, except that at one point, a country bumpkin teaches a butler how to play Call of Duty, and that is awesome. 5 out of 10. Midnight Sky is a George Clooney directed sci-fi movie that wants to be seen as patient and reflective and cerebral, but I think a more apt description would actually be boring. It's got some really fun production design though. Good score too. 5 out of 10. Sylvia's Love is a throwbacky, sincere, charming period romance with a mostly black cast. And if you like hot actors dressed up like it's the 50s falling in love with each other, you'll love it. I think it's a 5 out of 10. So now that those are out of the way, we can move on to the good stuff. I mean, I don't know, not the good stuff, just the more interesting stuff. Mank, it's Mank! The whole world's got Mank fever! Stay inside, it's Mank-a-palooza out there! Mank is more like sitting down and reading a really interesting book than it is an edge-of-your-seat cinematic experience. It tells the debatably true story behind the Citizen Kane script by writer Herman Mankiewicz. But the movie's not really so much about the script itself as much as it's trying to contextualize the political landscape in which it was written. This movie's all about Herman Mankiewicz being slowly radicalized by watching wealthy Hollywood executives continuing to rake in cash during the Great Depression. It's about the ethics of filmmaking and the power of motion pictures as propaganda machines. And all that stuff rules, obviously, but then there's also like half an hour of Gary Oldman laying in bed and ordering housemaids around, which is less interesting, in my opinion. But nevertheless, it's a fascinating and intellectual movie with a great soundtrack that I was still thinking about for days afterwards. 8 out of 10. Sound of Metal is my favorite movie of the year by a country mile. Like, every other movie can fuck off, because it's like not even close. Like, if every other movie in the world is like here, Sound of Metal is like, oh, here. It's like outrageous how much better Sound of Metal is than every other movie. Sound of Metal is about a metal drummer who suffers sudden and catastrophic hearing loss and has to quickly and immediately start to come to terms with his new life and new status quo as a deaf person. It tackles issues of identity and issues of disability and community, and Riz Ahmed is gonna win Best Actor this year, or I will burn Hollywood to the fucking ground. I'm serious. This movie illuminates deaf culture for a wide audience in a way that no other movie I've ever seen can pull off. I remember taking American Sign Language classes in high school and our teacher showing us Mr. Holland's Opus to illustrate points about deaf culture. And I just can't get over how much better this movie is than Mr. Holland's Opus. I'm so jealous of future ASL students. And aside from the incredible story, the directing and sound design of this thing are absolutely sublime. Check out this scene where Riz Ahmed is standing next to a woman speaking sign language. Look how the camera not only puts you into his experience, but illustrates exactly what his experience is. He doesn't fucking know what they're saying, and even if you as an audience member happen to already know sign language, you wouldn't know either. This is director Darius Martyr's first ever feature film, and he is able to generate so much empathy through his direction. It blows me away. God, this movie's so great. 10 out of 10. Easy 10 out of 10. The only 10 out of 10 in this whole video series. Let Them All Talk is Steven Soderbergh's latest star-studded, no-budget, direct-to-streaming project. It's a great demonstration of semi-improvisational acting and micro-budget guerrilla filmmaking, but it pretty much leaves the mind the instant the credits start to roll. It's totally relaxing and pleasant to watch, but it's so airy and tone-forward, it's hard to say much else about it. Meryl Streep is great, Lucas Hedges is great, Gemma Chan is great. Totally cool, fine movie. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. The Prom is Ryan Murphy's adaptation of the short-lived Broadway musical, in which a cadre of Broadway divas invade a small rural town in order to stick up for a young lesbian whose prom is being canceled by the homophobic PTA. As a musical and as a blockbuster, it's catchy and funny and loud in all the right ways, but as a text, it's a little confused. It clearly proposes that wealthy coastal elites looking down their nose and writing off rural Americans as podunk, bass-ackwards bigots is condescending and counterproductive to any real dialogue. But then, when they arrive in Indiana, the movie kind of treats the locals like podunk, bass-ackwards bigots. It wants to simultaneously humanize homophobes as people, but also condemn homophobia so soundly that there's no real room for debate, and just sort of completely cancels itself out. And on top of that, it's also never quite sure whether the town in question is like a rural farm town or a bustling metropolis, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, the performances are fun, and the characters are engaging, there's some great jokes and some excellent musical numbers, but, you know, don't go into it expecting anything ideologically coherent. I'll give The Prom a 6 out of 10. I have always had a tricky relationship with cartoon saloon movies. Each one is an unambiguous stylistic masterpiece in its own right, but I almost always come away feeling underwhelmed by the writing. This movie feels like a renaissance for the medium of animation in and of itself. It looks totally unlike anything else you've ever seen before. It completely blows its peers out of the water in terms of style and craft, and the script is it's fine. That said, it is easily my favorite of the cartoon saloon movies I've seen, and truly in this case, I think the triumphs of traditional animation, style, and tone could outweigh even the most boring of scripts. Easily worth the price of admission for Apple TV if you don't have it, and maybe you can catch Ted Lasso on the way out. It's a good-ass show. But I'll give Wolfwalkers an 8 out of 10. Ma Rainey's Black Bottom is a movie that's honestly tough to pass any sort of judgment on because it's just so totally eclipsed by Chadwick Boseman's tragic, untimely death. Personally, I never felt like Boseman quite got the instant classic lightning in a bottle, Rebel Without a Cause, Brokeback Mountain performance that he was so clearly capable of delivering. And as much as I wish Black Bottom was it, and even though I do think he's pretty good in it, I just don't think it is. The movie is Netflix's third adaptation of a play in the last 6 months, and it's a fun, delightfully existential script with great performances and zippy, claustrophobic momentum, despite feeling a little bit bottled sometimes. It looks like it's shaping up to be an Oscar frontrunner in multiple performance categories, but honestly, it just doesn't hit with me in the way it does some other people. And if Chadwick Boseman's gonna win an Oscar this year, it should be for Da 5 Bloods anyway. I'll give Ma Rainey a 7 out of 10. I'll keep this short since I already recorded a whole podcast on this movie, but Soul is every bit a full-blooded, mega-budget, king-size Pixar feature, despite being pushed to streaming at the last second by COVID-19. Sometimes these movies that get kicked to Disney Plus can feel like damaged goods. Artemis Fowl! Artemis Fowl! I'm talking about Artemis Fowl! But Soul fully delivers on the lofty bar Pixar has set for itself time and time again. It's a big-hearted movie about identity and personhood and you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but life. It's got a distinct and expressive visual style in a way that Pixar movies don't always have, and it's just as powerful as Pete Docter's best work as a director. And Soul gets an 8 out of 10. And finally, we arrive at Wonder Woman 1984, the movie that single-handedly killed this series. I mean, not really. I mean, kind of it did, but not, you know. Again, this is a movie I've already spoken about publicly at length in a podcast episode with Cosmonaut Meg, but suffice it to say, it's an overlong, ill-thought-out, nearly incoherent mess of a superhero sequel with exactly one good performance from Chris Pine. Wonder Woman 1984 is only the first of WB's HBO simultaneous releases scheduled for the next year, including everything from highly anticipated blockbusters like Dune and Matrix 4, to children's movies like Tom and Jerry, to small-budget Oscar plays like Judas and the Black Messiah. The lines have officially blurred, and cinemas and streaming services are now one and the same. At least, that's true in the eyes of Time Warner. And that might not necessarily be a bad thing in terms of the industry, but it definitely is a bad thing for me talking about the distinguishing characteristics of streaming movies. But nevertheless, and in spite of all of that, Wonder Woman 1984 is just not fun to watch. It's really just not good. I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Which brings us back around to the point of these videos, answering the question, do streaming movies actually live up to their horrible reputation? Was their image in any way rehabilitated over the last few months? Was it worth it to watch as many movies as I did? Should we shut down the internet? All questions I'm about to answer. What I'm about to say are facts, backed up by logic and science. Last time I said stuff like that, people didn't really like it, but I'm doubling down. But if I'm being honest, if I were really being scientific about this, I would have had some kind of control. I only watched the streaming movies in the back half of this year. I didn't watch every other movie. I didn't watch all of the streaming movies from another year. All I've got is this one set of data points and sort of vague anecdotal evidence about what other movies are like. The only conclusion I'm really equipped to draw from the data I collected is whether or not I liked the movies I watched. And the answer to that is, yeah, sometimes. When you take the average of all the scores I collected, you end up with 5.37 out of 10. Which feels about right. I mean, there were a bunch of movies I loved and a bunch of movies that I hated and like a ton of movies that were just totally fine. They were like fully movies, you know? There were pleasant surprises and extraordinary disappointments and movies that did exactly what you expected them to do, for better or worse. But there are some trends I noticed over the course of this series. Each streaming service is starting to come into their own in terms of what kind of movies they make. Netflix movies make up their own subgenres all by themselves. Netflix makes small, cheesy romances, big, loud military action flicks, and relatively expensive auteur blank checks. Apple TV loves anything that has big-name talent working on small personal projects, and Hulu likes micro-budget comedies and horror movies. Disney Plus has its own selection of inspirational tearjerkers and big blockbusters that got pushed out of theaters, and Amazon likes to distribute indie movies more than anything. The only one who feels like they're still trying to find their identity is HBO Max. There's not a lot of a pattern to what they've put out. Oh, and Peacock didn't. The only movie they did was the Curious George one. So the kind of movies that Peacock makes are Curious George, Go West, Go Wild. That's kind of their type. If you were to graph out all the scores that I gave the movies, you'd notice that a lot of them were 5s or 6s. You know, there were a few that were really exceptional and less that were really horrible. And for the most part, they're just fine. Which has honestly been my experience with regular theatrical movies, right? Like, most movies are fine. If you look at my top 20 movies of 2020, I just said that out loud and I realized that it sounds really pithy. I didn't mean for it to be that way. It's just a number. If you look at my top movies of 2020, all of them except 2 were exclusive to a streaming service, which felt like a glowing endorsement until I realized that exactly the same thing could be said of my bottom movies of the year. Which leads me to the final answer, the final conclusion of Full Stream Ahead, which is this. They're fine. The movies are fine. At least in a pandemic, streaming movies are just as good as regular movies. The only thing that's different is they don't come out on Blu-ray afterward. There are plenty of bad ones, and there are plenty of good ones. But this curve feels like it reflects a totally normal gradient of quality. Maybe even trending slightly higher than I would have expected. And yeah, there are a lot of bad ones, but newsflash, lots of regular movies are bad too. Get over yourself. So would I recommend watching everything all the time? No, of course I wouldn't. It's not that fun, and it's a lot of work. To be honest, it takes a lot of time to do that. Obviously, you have to editorialize and figure out what's worth your time, but I will say that doing this project made me watch a lot of movies that I probably wouldn't have under normal circumstances. And sometimes I was really surprised by them. Things like Uncle Frank, His House, Boys in the Band, Get Duked. I never would have watched any of those movies. Zero chance I would have even thought about them. But I watched them for this and I liked them a lot. So I guess if anything can be taken away, it's just, I don't know, try stuff. Try stuff more often. You might be surprised. But that said, you guys have no idea how good it feels for me to not have to watch that new Anthony Mackie movie. It doesn't look good. I'm not gonna watch it. He's like a cyborg or something. Looks shitty. Don't ever have to think about it. Not even once. I'm just saying that out loud for the first time. I don't have to watch that new Anthony Mackie movie. I don't have to do it. I'm like the genie at the end of Aladdin. I'm free. And that's the end of my script. I didn't fully figure out what I wanted to say at the end, but now that I'm here, I guess just, you know, movies are good. It's fun. It's fun to watch things. It's fun to think about things. That doesn't mean anything. That's nothing. That's absolutely nothing, and I'm not going to put it in the video. But if you do want to hear what I have to say about some other things, like some other movies, for instance, I've got a weekly podcast called No Nerds Allowed. My sister and I and a friend of ours stream the podcast live on YouTube and Twitch simultaneously every single week. And you can also stick around, subscribe to the channel. You'll get those podcast notifications, but you'll also get my monthly-ish, just videos like this. I've got a lot of fun ideas bouncing around about what I want to work on now that I'm done with this series, and I'm really excited to get to work on them. So if you want to see what that is as much as I want to make them, go ahead and fucking ring that bell. And I think that's pretty much all I've got to say. I just want to say thank you guys for sticking around and watching all these videos if you have been. I really appreciate it, and you know, we're pretty small right now, and every view, we're still at a point where pretty much every view means something, you know, so it means a lot to us that people keep tuning in.
Do the Gatsby.
Oh, this is for the thumbnail. What kind of face does he make?
You know, yeah, that's the one.
Is that good?
Very nice.
Okay. That's all. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.
Okay. Now, let's reset.
Ring that bell, pussy.